Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So this week, we have a deck that is super sweet. I am so in love with this deck. So last week on Against Odds, we were playing Triskaidekaphobia, and we ran into this really crazy mono blue Brain in the Jar deck in Standard. So it looked really interesting, and from the cards we saw, it looked super cheap. So I did a little digging and found a list. Someone actually emailed me one as well. The list had been floating around a little bit, so thanks for that. And made a few changes and decided we were going to go with it. So this deck is $20 in paper, 9 ticks online. So it's the version we're playing in the video is already cheaper than the ultra budget list I always post in the article. So this is as cheap as it gets. It doesn't get any cheaper than this. And the deck is actually super sweet. I have been very, very, very impressed with this deck. So let's break it down. So the deck is essentially this weird combo deck. All you do is draw cards, draw cards, draw cards, draw cards, draw some more cards, and then eventually you cast a Rise from the Tides, which is a 6-mana sorcery that gives you a 2/2 black zombie creature token that enters the battlefield tapped for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard. So by the time we cast this, we are usually getting somewhere between 15 2/2 zombies and 25 2/2 zombies. So that's, you know, a lot of power and toughness, between 30 and 50 power and toughness for only 6 mana, which is pretty absurd. The problem with Rise from the Tides is twofold. For one thing, our deck doesn't do anything except draw cards until we cast Rise from the Tides, which means any removal our opponent happens to have is just sitting in their hand. Targeted removal obviously doesn't matter. We're not afraid of Grasp of Darkness when we have 20 2/2 zombie tokens, but something like Languish or Filleting Tendrils or Radiant Flames could ruin our entire plan. And because the zombies enter the battlefield tapped, it makes it even more complicated. So, because they can't really block or chump or anything. So the idea is we need to play Rise from the Tides in such a manner that our opponent doesn't get a chance to untap and kill all our zombies with a Languish or Radiant Flames, one of those type of cards. So option A is to use Brain in the Jar, which is a card that I did not expect to be playing. So 2-mana artifact, you can pay 1, tap it, and put a charge counter on it. And then you can cast an instant or sorcery for free with the same converted mana cost as the number of charge counters on it. So the first time you do it, you can cast a 1-mana instant or sorcery, then 2 mana, 3 mana, 4 mana. It just keeps going up the line. And then it also has an ability where you can pay 3, tap it, remove X charge counters, and scry X. So you can kind of reset it, but it's really slow. So ideally, we would play a Brain in the Jar on turn 3, and over the next few turns, keep plussing it, hopefully cast some of our card draw spells along the way, and then when we get up to 6 mana, we can activate Brain in the Jar on the end of our opponent's turn. When they can't cast sorceries, we get all our tap zombies, we untap all of our 20, 25, however many 2/2 zombie tokens, and just swing for lethal. We also have a plan B, because sometimes Brain in the Jar doesn't work. People do play Anguish Unmaking, they do play Artifact Removal in the sideboard sometimes. There are cards that kill Brain in the Jar. So Kolaghan's Command is a big main deck one. So sometimes we can't rely on Brain in the Jar, especially since we need to wait 6 turns after we cast it to get to Rise from the Tides. So it gives our opponent a lot of time to find an answer. In these situations, we just get up to 12 mana, with the help of Mage Ring Network, adding storage counters, and we simply cast a Rise from the Tides during our main phase. Then, using our other 6 mana, we cast a Part the Water Veil so we get an extra turn, and we untap with all our zombies and kill our opponent. The other thing with Part the Water Veil that is super awesome is it kind of allows us to do this weird untap your birthing pod trick with Brain in the Jar. So we can get to like 3 counters on Brain in the Jar, and assuming we have at least 7 lands and a bunch of Part the Water Veils, we can play a Part the Water Veil, use our turn to tap Brain in the Jar, get it up to 4 counters. Then next turn, cast another Part the Water Veil, tap the Brain in the Jar, up to 5 counters. Next turn, Part the Water Veil, tap the Brain in the Jar, up to 6 counters, put the Rise from the Tides into play, and our extra turn kill our opponent. So there are definitely times when we can kind of just combo off by taking those extra turns and use it to build up into our Rise from the Tides to win the game. So that is how the deck works. That is how the deck wins. That is all there is to it. The rest of the deck, I love it. All we do is draw cards. Literally, that is what the deck does. 4 anticipates. So look at the top 3, put 1 in your hand. For nagging thoughts, look at the top 2, put 1 in your hand, 1 in your graveyard. For pieces of the puzzle, look at the top 5, put 2 instants or sorceries in your hand, the rest in the graveyard. And pour over the pages, draw 3, untap 2 lands, and then discard a card. And actually, the untapping 2 lands and then discard a card allows us to madness the nagging thoughts if we want to. So, we cast these normally, we cast them off Brain in the Jar. This is how we fill up our graveyard, is just over the first 5-6 turns of the game. We are just casting these spells every turn, sometimes multiple copies in a turn, building up our graveyard full of instants and sorceries for a Rise from the Tides, while also setting up our hand, getting the Rise from the Tides, getting hopefully multiple Part the Water Veils, everything we need to finally combo off. Couple notes on these cards in specific. For one thing, with Brain in the Jar, it takes away any timing restrictions if you didn't realize that with Rise from the Tides. So if you have a Brain in the Jar on 1 counter, and you tap it on your opponent's end of turn to add a 2nd counter, you can cast the Nagging Thoughts, even though it's a sorcery, so that's worth noting. Also, there are times with pieces of the puzzle where we will choose to fail to find any instants or sorceries. Sometimes we know we're going to be casting a Rise from the Tides next turn, and we just want more zombies. So instead of putting the instants and sorceries in our hand, we just dump all 5 cards into our graveyard, even though there are instants or sorceries we could take. That is a legal and legitimate play, just to mill 5 cards with pieces of the puzzle. So keep that in mind. And pour over pages, the neat part about this one is if we get a Brain in the Jar up to 5, we can actually use it to generate an additional mana, because we tap 2 lands, use the Brain to activate, cast the pour over pages, untap both lands, so we actually come up 1 mana ahead in that scenario. Then we have a small bit of defense. Grip of the Royal is a card that taps down a creature, and it doesn't untap until its next untap step. Or it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step, rather. But it also draws us a card, so it's just another instant or sorcery in our graveyard for Rise from the Tides. We can put it into play off Brain in the Jar, and it keeps drawing us cards, while also giving us a little bit of fringe benefit. Engulf the Shore is our way to stay alive, fog our opponent out on turn 4, turn 5, bounce everything back to their hand, and then that usually gives us enough time to go and combo off with Rise from the Tides, Part the Water Veil, and Brain from the Jar. Finally, a single copy of Disperse, just another way to help keep us alive. Manabase wise, I already mentioned the Maze Ring networks. They are important to our backup plan of getting to 12 mana to cast a Part the Water Veil and Rise from the Tides in the same turn. Bladed Cataract, I put them in the deck because I thought it could draw us more cards. After playing like 10 plus matches with this deck, I think maybe I have sacked a Bladed Cataract to draw cards 1 time. So I don't really think they need to be in the deck. You probably just play 4 more islands. That said, I think the deck can support 8 colorless lands. So if you can think of another colorless land that would fit well in this deck, feel free to run it in the Bladed Cataract slot book. And then the 15 islands to power up our Engulf the Shore, cast all our blue spells. Sideboard, we have a bunch of counters, so we do run into matchups sometimes where our creature stuff, Engulf the Shore, Grip of the Royal, are very bad. Our opponent's either playing no creatures or very few creatures. So we can simply take all those out and replace them with Negates, Dispels, and Void Shatters, because the decks with no creatures are usually control decks and trying to win with Planeswalkers, powerful spells, and then we can use our counter spells to interact with those decks and get rid of the bounce spells. Although I will say, at first I was taking out all the Engulf the Shores against these decks, but I've started leaving in 1 or 2 Engulf the Shores, mostly for creature lands, because that's a way in creature-free matchups that we do lose, since we don't have much actual removal. There are times where our opponent just has a couple creature lands, activates them every turn, keep attacking, and can get our life total down pretty quickly. So it's nice to still have some amount of creature bounce, but cut back on it a lot in those matchups. And then we have 4 Send to Sleeps against big creature matchups where we need to stall out against creatures more. And then 2 more Disperse. This is very specifically for decks with Virulent Plague, because we really have a hard time beating Virulent Plague without Disperse. With Disperse, it's fine, because we get to the point where we just bounce it on the end of our opponent's turn. Then we either combo off during our main phase with Part the Water Veil and Rise from the Tides, or we do the end step, Rise from the Tides off Braid in the Jar. So with Disperse, it's fine, but I wanted to be able to bring in more copies because I was worried that our opponent would dress away our single Disperse we have in the main deck, and then we wouldn't have a way to win with Rise from the Tide. So if you're playing against a deck with Virulent Plague, bring in more Disperses. So that's the deck, and I have to say, I mean, I'm not going to spoil the matches, but it is way more competitive than I ever could have imagined. It is super fun. Like, I totally love playing it. It leads to some awesome moments. We have times where it almost feels like the Turbo Turn deck, where we take 3 or 4 extra turns in a row, because we're just so good at digging through our deck with all of our card draw spells and pieces of the puzzle that it's really easy to assemble 3 or 4 copies of Part the Water Veil. And then Rise from the Tides is just so sweet. When you cast a 6-mana spell to make 20 plus 2/2 zombies, it just feels incredibly busted. So I love the deck. I think it's awesome. I think it's actually pretty competitive. It's obviously matchup dependent to some extent, but still, I think this deck is very competitive and very good, and I am super impressed with it, especially for the price. You just can't go wrong. This one's almost a free roll at $20 and 9 ticks in paper. And if you already have Part the Water Veils from Turbo Turns, that cuts the price even further in half. Like, if you have those on Magic Online, I think the deck will cost you like 4 tickets, and in paper it's down to like 12, 13 tickets. So there's just not a lot of money you need to spend to build this deck. Anyway, make sure to check out the website, mtggoldfish.com. You got tons of great content, decks, prices, metagame strategy, everything and anything you could want related to Magic the Gathering. And if you enjoyed the video, take a minute, click the subscribe button, click the like button that's about to pop up on the bottom of your screen. It'll keep you up to date on all the latest and greatest in video content from mtggoldfish.com. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoy our Mono Blue Brains video. I think you will, because it is super sweet. And I will talk to you soon.